Okay, everyone ready? Everyone ready? Okay. President Trump issued an executive order today, and its purported purpose was to enhance public safety. But here in New York City and in cities across this nation, this executive order could, in fact, undermine public safety and make our neighborhoods less safe. Firstly, because this executive order could undermine the relationship between our police department and our communities, which has been the foundation of our ability to drive down crime. Second, because the potential funding cuts suggested in the executive order would first and foremost fall on the NYPD, thus taking away resources that we use every day to protect the people of this city against crime and against terrorism. So the executive order on its face contradicts its stated purpose. And again, this is true here in New York City and will be true in cities all over the country. There are hundreds of cities that work with their immigrant populations, including their undocumented immigrants. Here in this city, a community numbering almost 500,000 people. Hundreds of American cities where this executive order could undermine public safety, create a rift and a disconnect between police departments and those they serve, and take away funding from law enforcement. That's the potential magnitude of what we face here. But at the same time, it is important to understand that in New York City, this executive order does not change who we are or how we will go about doing our work. The stroke of a pen in Washington does not change the people of New York City or our values, does not change how this city government protects its people. The executive order will not change how we enforce the law in New York City or how we do business on behalf of the people, all 8.5 million New Yorkers. This is a city of immigrants. We always have been for almost 400 years. This is our fundamental nature. You look at all those gathered around me, I want to thank all the leaders of this administration and other key partners who have gathered here. And if you look at this group of New Yorkers, we represent nations all over the globe in terms of the backgrounds of our families. This is a picture of the immigrant experience right here before you. It's also a picture of a city that works and a city that respects all people, tries to include everyone and respect their rights. This is the American dream right before your eyes, and we are not going to allow it to be undermined. We're going to defend all of our people, regardless of where they come from and regardless of their documentation status. We are also proud of the fact that New York City is the safest big city in America. It's because of the extraordinary work of the men and women of the NYPD, but it's also because of the work of so many partners and communities all over the city who help the NYPD in its work, who trust the NYPD, who provide information and support to the NYPD, who help our officers to stay safe. We're a city in which people, regardless of documentation status, know they can report a crime, or if they're a victim of a crime, can come forward, witness to a crime, they can come forward and know that information will be used to keep us all safe, but it will not be used to deport them. That fundamental compact that goes back in this city decades through Democratic, Republican, and independent administrations here in New York City is one of the reasons why we became the safest big city in America. And we're not going to undermine the progress the NYPD has made over a quarter century. The spirit of this executive order runs contrary to our character and our values as a city, and I would argue it runs contrary to the character and values of the United States. Now, as we've looked at the executive order just in the last hour or two, we do want to let the people of New York City know that there is less here than meets the eye. This executive order is written in a very vague fashion. We believe that not only will it be susceptible to many legal challenges, but that it will meet with tremendous public resistance all over the nation. that there will be a fundamental sense of unfairness recognized in this executive order, and that the legal issues that will be raised could fundamentally change the outcome. I want to note that we believe we are on solid ground for a legal challenge to the executive order should the occasion arise and be necessary. Specifically, among other reasons, specifically because some recent years ago when the federal government tried to withhold unrelated funding from states in a similar action, none other than Chief Justice John Roberts wrote an opinion in the Supreme Court case NFIB versus Sebelius 2012, which prohibited the federal government from broad brush withholding of funds, and Justice Roberts wrote that such an action would be the federal government, quote unquote, holding a gun to the head of states and cities. So that broad brush action was banned by the United States Supreme Court. Following that logic, a narrow application of the executive order means that money that would be withheld from law enforcement, specifically from the NYPD. So the sum total would be both an unfair action that would cause a rift between the NYPD and the communities it serves, while simultaneously taking resources away from the NYPD that it uses to keep us safe. A double jeopardy for the NYPD. Notwithstanding the challenges and problems we see here, it's important to remind all New Yorkers that the NYPD, Department of Corrections, the City of New York, has been cooperating with the federal government over these last years in terms of sharing information and working in cases involving individuals who have committed 170 different offenses. This is public record. I'll hold it up here and we will distribute it. These are a list of the 170 offenses that by city law trigger specific cooperation between the City of New York and the federal government in the case of an undocumented individual. These are serious offenses, violent crimes. This is the law of New York City, has been for years, and has been the basis for productive cooperation with the federal government. This works. It has been working. It's helped to keep us safe without undermining the relationship between our police and our communities. This will continue. But we will not deport law-abiding New Yorkers. We will not tear families apart. We will not leave children without their parents. We will not take breadwinners away from families who have no one else. And we're not going to undermine the hard-won trust that has developed between our police and our communities. The NYPD began this day winning the war against crime and terror, using the right approach, and that approach will continue tomorrow. A few words in Spanish. Nueva York ha sido un lugar inclusivo desde antes que el presidente firmara su orden ejecutiva y sigue siendo inclusiva. Esta orden no puede cambiar lo que somos. Somos una ciudad de inmigrantes y la ciudad de la oportunidad. Esto no es un asunto que afecta solo a algunos grupos. Somos todos Nueva York. With that, I want to introduce our Police Commissioner, Jimmy O'Neill.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So I started off today I gave the NYPD, the State of the NYPD and the Police Foundation breakfast this morning. I talked about all the gains we've made, not only over the last 3 years, but over the last 25 years. And if you look at where New York is right now, with homicides down in 2016, a tremendous reduction in shootings, down over 12%, overall crime down 4%, and we're starting out 2017 in a pretty good place, too. You know, I don't want to do anything that would put any of that at risk, and a huge part of that is our neighborhood policing program. And the neighborhood policing, the goal there is, of course, is to keep New Yorkers safe, but it's also to build trust. And we build trust by having that connection between the communities that we're sworn to protect and serve and the police officers. And again, I wouldn't want to do anything to put that at risk. Every day we work closely with our federal partners, specifically the FBI, the Marshal Service, the DEA, and the ATF. And it's in conjunction with our federal partners that we continue to push crime down. I wouldn't want to do anything to jeopardize that. The U.S. Marshal Service, the Regional Fugitive Task Force, continue to do an outstanding job going after the worst of the worst that commit crimes in this city, or if they commit crimes in other cities and come here. So the financial backing for these efforts comes from a pool of money from the federal government. Part of that funds the overtime for those task forces, and there's also the UASI funds that we've spoken about in the past, the Urban Area Security Initiative. That's about $110 million that we use to protect this great city. And that money goes towards radiological detection equipment, highly trained vapor wake dogs. We've spoken about that in the past. Our intelligence analysis, the Lower Manhattan Security Initiative, our network of public and private cameras that aid in numerous investigations, training and equipment for the NYPD's bomb squad, which most recently proved itself invaluable in the investigation of the Chelsea bombing. So again, wouldn't want to put any of that at risk. We already removed the worst criminals from New York, including those who have been convicted of serious crimes and have been deported, and violent felons. So I think there's a very delicate balance in New York City right now. I think that's why we're doing so well. And to do anything that would eat at that trust, I think would be a disservice to the people of this great city. So thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Commissioner. Now I'll introduce Speaker of the City Council, Melissa Mark-Viverito.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, Commissioner, my colleagues. Vanessa Gibson, my colleague and chair of the Public Safety Committee. For me, this is a sad day in these United States of America in terms of what it was that President Trump presented today. So if there was ever any doubt in anyone's mind whether Donald Trump's hateful, bigoted rhetoric truly reflected his intentions, today's executive orders affirm that his agenda will take our country down a dangerous and divisive path. If this is his idea of immigration reform, and he did use that when he had his press conference and spoke about his executive orders, he's simply delusional. This isn't reform. This doesn't fix our problems. This simply creates heartache for millions of families, and as the commissioner said, potentially puts this city at risk. But our city knows better. Let's be clear, these proposals are driven by the false narrative that immigrants, all immigrants, are criminals. So what President Trump seems to forget is that America is a nation of immigrants. New Yorkers know that immigrants contribute to our economy, our culture, and our community. They are our friends, our coworkers, and our neighbors. We're not here to defend any criminal offenders. In fact, our laws do not provide that protection, as the mayor clearly indicated. But what you're seeing today, and actually I was the key author of both of those pieces of legislation. In fact, our laws do not provide that protection, but what you're seeing today from the Trump administration is a deflection of the true issues that we have at hand. Why aren't we talking about tightening the loopholes in our gun laws? Why aren't we talking about the thousands of gun violence victims? Utilizing families and their pain or criminalizing undocumented immigrants is part of the false narrative that Trump continues to hold up. So today, I want to send a very clear message to New Yorkers and to the Trump administration. Although there are many unknowns, one thing is certain. The City Council's commitment, this city's commitment to supporting our immigrant communities is unwavering. We will continue to build and expand on our laws and policies to do everything in our power to protect our communities. And we will uphold the rule of law and defy any attack by the president to force us to violate the constitutional rights of our residents. We will resist, we will defy, and we will stand by New Yorkers. If I could just say a few words in Spanish. Hoy hemos visto muy claramente que el presidente Donald Trump tiene todas las intenciones de dividir a nuestro país y separar a nuestras familias. Él puede decir que sus acciones ejecutivas son parte de una reforma migratoria, pero eso es absurdo. Esto no es una reforma, esto no soluciona nuestros problemas, esto solo causa temor en nuestras familias. Así que dejemos algo muy claro. Estas decisiones están tomando lugar porque el presidente Trump opina que todos los inmigrantes son criminales, que somos malas personas. Lo que Trump no sabe es que los Estados Unidos es un país de inmigrantes, enriquecido gracias a los inmigrantes. Utilizar a nuestras familias y criminalizar a los inmigrantes indocumentados es simplemente parte de la falsa y alarmante narrativa de Trump. Así que vamos a decir algo y vamos a dejarlo claro. Esta ciudad no dejará de apoyar a nuestra comunidad de inmigrantes. Continuaremos expandiendo nuestras leyes y políticas para hacer todo lo posible para proteger a nuestros inmigrantes y defenderemos la Constitución de este país para que nadie pueda violar los derechos civiles de nuestros residentes.
Thank you very much. Finally, I want you to hear from a man who represents literally one of the most diverse congressional districts in the United States of America and is one of the leaders of the Democrats in the House of Representatives, Congressman Joe Crowley.
Mr. Mayor, how are you? Mr. Commissioner, how are you? Good to see you. I'm sad to be here this evening, but I am proud to be here as well. So I want to thank the Mayor, the Commissioner, the Speaker, the members of the Council, administration that's here today to stand up for not just immigrant New York, but all New York and the values of our country. This week, we've seen some remarkable changes made in just 5 days that have really turned around, in many respects, the direction of the focus of the last 75 years of our nation. The good news is that simply by executive order, you can't change the world overnight, but it's very scary in terms of what this man has been about. After hearing that maybe there was a bigger crowd at previous inaugurations than at his inauguration, he went to the CIA at the Wall of Honor and really spent very little time talking about the men and women who had sacrificed their lives for information that was given to our country to help win the Cold War, to win other wars as well, and to help keep us safe after 9/11. No city knows it better than we do, the effects of terrorism. And he used that opportunity to talk about himself and his alternative facts. We know that the president today used the opportunity in terms of the executive order to have the families of victims of crime, people who had been murdered by undocumented, in his words, illegal aliens, in the president's words. Our hearts, and I think I speak on behalf of the mayor and everyone in this room, go out to each and every one of those families, the victims of crime. But to take that as an opportunity to blanket all people who have come to this country for a better way of life, that is immoral. That is immoral, to do that, to use those people. So my wife, Casey, says, don't pay attention to what he says, watch what he does. And this executive action is immoral. It is actually going to limit the ability for our law enforcement individuals, folks, just like what he's done at the national level with our intelligence folks. Commissioner O'Neill needs intelligence. That's right. This is going to shut down intelligence gathering in this city. It's going to shut down the ability of our law enforcement folks to get information from law-abiding individuals who want to expose the criminal element within the city, within the immigrant population as well. Much of that will be shut down now out of fear that they themselves will be deported. This has been a policy that has been in place here in New York City over administration after administration, including the Giuliani administration. This is not Democrat and Republican. It's not just Democrats. Republicans have also enforced this very same procedure. So as an author of the OASI accounts, post 9/11 again, to make sure that we get all the resources we need from our federal government to protect us from foreign people who are terrorists, who want to attack our nation and everything we stand for, this scares the daylights out of me. For a cheap political stunt that he would threaten to withhold funding to our law enforcement that can make us vulnerable to a terrorist attack, that's immoral. It has to be called out for what it is. So I want to applaud the mayor again, the commissioner. We're a donor state to the federal government. we give more to the federal government than we get back. And I would imagine that most of the so-called sanctuary cities come from donor states. They give more than they get back. And you know what? New Yorkers are getting tired more and more that we're a donor state, and we have other states and states electing people like Donald Trump who then come in and dictate to us that we're going to get less than we deserve to keep our citizens safe. So I applaud the mayor, the commissioner, all the electeds, and part of the administration for being here today and standing up for what is right. This is not the American way. I'm the son and grandson of immigrants. This is not the American way. This is not what we have been about over the last 75 years. And Donald Trump needs to hear it. Thank you.
Thank you, brother. Okay, with that, we want to thank you very much, Congressman, for that very powerful statement, and I think we're all feeling that same passion today. We welcome your questions on the executive order. Yeah.
Mayor, at a practical level, how much can the president withhold money that is earmarked for law enforcement? And I also wondered if you see what you're doing now as an act of civil disobedience against the federal government.
I do not see it as civil disobedience. I think we are doing what's right for our people. We are defending the interests and the needs of New Yorkers under the law, and we're supporting law enforcement in the work it does. And as I said, this executive order is very vague. And our Corporation Counsel, Zach Carter, is here, former U.S. attorney earlier in his life, and made very clear to me today that if any action is taken as a result to restrict our funding, at that point we will bring legal action to stop it. So remember, the executive order, in addition to being vague, is theoretical. But if anything actually starts to move, the city of New York will take legal action to stop the executive order from hurting our people and our city.
And the first part of that, I mean, you said that what he could do is, under the law, he couldn't, let's say, withhold transportation funding or school funding, but he could withhold probably NYPD funding, or at least theoretically. So can he do that without congressional approval, or is there a pocket of money that the president has that the NYPD is banking on?
Well, I'll start, and Zach may join in here, or Jimmy may join in here to add to it. Look, the way we read this, it identifies two agencies, Department of Homeland Security and Department of Justice. Those agencies do provide some funding to New York City, primarily to the NYPD, to a lesser extent to the Department of Correction. By our understanding of the law, and a very recent and clear and sharp decision of the United States Supreme Court, the only action that can be taken is specifically related to the subject matter at hand, and it means those two agencies. So lo and behold, what does that mean? This executive order, if it were to come to fruition, would substantially take money away from the NYPD. But again, if that were ever attempted, we would be in court immediately to stop it. And I know that will happen in cities all over the country. Do you want to add?
You know, as the mayor said, it is well established by Supreme Court authority that the federal government can't use the threat of withholding funds to coerce the states to conform with federal government-issued policies. I mean, that's a bedrock principle of federalism, and quite frankly, a bedrock conservative principle, somewhat ironically. So that can't happen lawfully. With respect to funding that's law enforcement specific, you know, like other executive orders that have been issued over the last few days, there are hedges embedded right in the order itself. It gives the Attorney General and the Secretary of Homeland Security discretion to permit funding to law enforcement agencies. So it threatens on the one hand, but provides a safety valve on the other. So it appears to be, frankly, more gesture than legal force.
And one other thing I'll cue you to mention, the constant invoking of the phrase as appropriate under the law.
Correct.
Appropriate under the law.
That is absolutely correct. If you look at the executive order a couple of times, there is the language that the Attorney General and the Secretary have discretion to do things consistent with law. They know what the law says, and they know what the law permits and what it doesn't permit.
Council Carter,
Yes.
You differed from what the mayor said regarding John Roberts' decision, because the mayor said that, talked about putting a gun to the head of states.
That was John Roberts' words.
John Roberts.
Right.
Putting a
Not
gun
my
to the head of states and cities. And you were very clear that it really just applies to states, that the Supreme Court has ruled that the federal government cannot coerce states into following certain policies, but
City's part of the state.
Right. Look at the executive order. The executive
Right.
order
So that-
refers to states and subdivisions thereof.
Correct.
all right.
Right.
With cities being a creation of the state, the cities don't have the same authority, same standing vis-à-vis the federal government to sue. This has been established in the 1920s and 30s.
Well, to the extent that we are, first of all, we expect that we will have the cooperation with our state counterpart, the Attorney General of the state of New York. I mean, but we are also, again, part of the state. We will have standing and capacity to sue, to defend the city against
We
defunding.
can get to the whole history of times we have been able to take legal action as a city. It's quite extensive, Laura.
The Controller's Office is saying, quoting us a figure that there is the funding that's at stake here. I just want to make sure that this is consistent with what you are saying, that it is 156 million in urban areas security initiative funding, and then 2 other grants of $6 million and $3 million apiece. Can you just break down what exactly you understand is the funding that's at risk here?
I'll give you the total breakdown after the press conference, but out of that 150, 110 is UASI funds, and that's anti-terrorism funding. There is also funding for our federal task forces, which pays for overtime. And there's also transit counterterrorism overtime, that's part of that also. And there's also funding we receive to cover all the missions, the UN missions and the national missions that are in New York City. So it is, it's anywhere between, it's above 150, and we're figuring anywhere between 150 and 160.
Is any of the grant funding that we're talking about here for programs like domestic violence victims?
There are miscellaneous grants that totals about 1.3 million, and I'd have to get you a breakdown of exactly what those grants are.
Let me just jump in for clarity. I think the simplest way to say it, first of all, very important, nothing has happened yet. So remember, there's 2 outs in the executive order, and Zach will correct me if there's anything that needs to be said more sharply. 1, consistent with the law. So it sounds very intense and very powerful in the first instance until you say consistent with the law. That immediately gets you to the Supreme Court decision, and that limits the options of federal government, among other laws that will. 2, that law enforcement can be exempted. It says it right there in the executive order. That could be applied to say, well, wait a minute, in this case, we won't take resources away from the NYPD. We don't know yet. The minute any specific action to withhold funding were to occur, that's when Zach Carter is in court the next hour. And then we would, of course, seek an injunction to freeze any effort to remove our funding at the point of contact. So I want you to hear those procedural points because it's not real until it happens. Second, just to what the commissioner said, so when you add everything together, we're still analyzing, but as he said, somewhere in excess of 150 million, but overwhelmingly that is anti-terrorism funding. Anti-terrorism funding is the thing they would have to take away. And then the second thing, as he mentioned, was the support we get to protect all of the leaders who come to New York City for the UN and so many other things that are crucial to the standing of the United States in the world. So these are big decisions the administration has to make. Do they actually want to take away that kind of funding from New York City? Yeah, Rich.
Mr. Mayor, so in some way, could Mr. Trump's order cut the funding to protect Trump Tower?
Rich, it's a fair question. Again, theoretically, it could be in the same bucket, but I would make the same point and then some. That I think that the president and his team are going to have to look long and hard at the notion of taking away anti-terrorism funding from New York City, taking away funding that protects foreign leaders who visit New York City, and taking away funding that protects Trump Tower and everyone who works in it and lives in it and visits it. So we'll see on each of those things. But the very fact this executive order would be aimed at the funding that keeps people safe is going to be something they'll have to think about long and hard.
Two questions. The first is just a numerical one. You held up a list of, 170 offenses that you will turn someone over to ICE. How many folks have been turned over to ICE each year under those 170 crimes?
I want to see if either Zach Carter or Nisha Argawal, who is our Commissioner for Immigrant Affairs, have those numbers handy, or do you want to get them back? We'll get them to you right after.
The second thing is, under the executive order, folks are deportable who've been convicted of any criminal offense, charged with any criminal offense, have committed acts that constitute a chargeable criminal offense. Are you reconsidering broken windows enforcement, given that you'll be saddling folks with criminal records and then subjecting them to potential deportation?
Look, let's take one thing at a time here. This has come out today, and as we're saying very squarely to you, we think there's a lot of vagueness in this executive order and tremendous opportunity for it to be challenged legally, let alone in the court of public opinion. So we're a long way from this having the effect that some may wish it to have. In the meantime, this is the safest big city in America. The NYPD continues to drive down crime while healing the relationship between police and community. We're going to stay on that track. It's as simple as that. Hold on. Look, I got some other folks, guys.
You mentioned the city seeking an injunction after a certain chain of events could happen.
Yeah.
What if the city is denied? How do you go about filling holes then?
Well, I want to say, first of all, Zach may want to jump in. We're not the only ones who are going to bring legal action. I think cities and states all over the country are going to bring legal action. Remember, President Obama put forward executive action on immigration, which a lot of us thought was a good idea. And you remember that played out in court over well over a year and a half, and ultimately was not able to proceed. So we have very recent history about proving to us that a presidential executive order is far from sacred, and there will be many, many jurisdictions that oppose this. And again, then there's the court of public opinion on top of it. And I think there's going to be many angles at which it is approached legally as well. Do you want to speak to it, or does that cover it? Okay. So that's why I'm not going to get into the business of theoretical next steps, because we think there's a long play out here. Congressman, please.
The issue of the Iwasi accounts,
Please,
just for a
please.
moment. The Iwasi accounts, when they were created 15 years ago, post 9/11, they've gone through a lot of politics in Washington. Many of the smaller cities and states around the country wanted more access to those accounts. I think it's important to note that they are based on threat assessment. So this is relevant to the Trump Towers. That's an increased threat assessment here in the city now that didn't exist maybe 3 or 4 months ago. So I think in that sense that these are reevaluated every year, and the allotment is based on a threat assessment and that's why New York City has such a great portion that we are under threat.
Constantly. Really?
The executive order also says that the federal government will essentially deputize local law enforcement to act as immigration officers, and it empowers the Secretary of Homeland Security to begin, or the Justice Department to begin negotiations with states and cities to do that. How will you respond?
I'll start and would welcome the Commissioner or Corporation Counsel to jump in if you want to after I start. We're not going to allow our police officers to be used as immigration enforcement agents. It's very simple. We have come so far in making this city safe and in building a better relationship between police and community. We are not going to take the very people who keep us safe every day and turn them against the communities they serve. It's as simple as that.
Given that New York is one of the few states left with a Democratic governor, do you think that Albany should make up the difference as far as any lost federal funds?
I don't even want to get into a discussion of lost federal funds because, again, I never hold it against you guys that you want to ask the theoretical or the situational question of what we might do in each circumstance. I want you to hear loud and clear, and I think the example I gave about President Obama's executive action should put a point on it for you. We are going to fight this, and cities and states all over the country are going to fight it. And looking at, and I yield to the Corporation Counsel on this, we are immediately struck by how vague it is and how subject to challenge it is. We're also struck by how many outs this executive order gives itself and gives the administration. So we're not going to get into the theoreticals of what we would do if we had funding cut. We have not had funding cut at this moment. We're going to continue to do our work. Do you want to add? Or okay. Anyone on this side? Anyone on this side? Yes.
Yeah. Speaker Mark Viverito and Congressman Crowley both talked about how Trump is trying to essentially criminalize immigrants. But he speaks very clearly that he's really just talking about illegal aliens. And even among those, just ones who have, like, say, committed crimes. I just want to know, do you see a difference between illegal aliens or undocumented immigrants, legal immigrants, who, you know, are most of the immigrants in New York City, and Americans generally? Like, should there be any distinction made?
Look, it's simple. I appreciate the ideological bent of your question, but I will answer it very clearly. I agree 100% with Speaker Melissa Mark-Viverito. There has been an attempt to demonize immigrants across the board. That's what's happening here. And the vast majority, even of the undocumented, are law-abiding people. And that's not pointed out in this discussion. The first words out of his mouth were his characterization of Mexicans as rapists and criminals. So this is not even close. This has been a very systematic, and this is where Steve Bannon is behind this 100%. This has been a systematic effort to demonize people of color and immigrants, and it's playing out today. Yes?
Mayor, did you discuss this at all in your meeting with Donald Trump first? And the second question is, you've often said you think because Donald Trump is a New Yorker that he wouldn't do things that would harm the city. Do you think you need to recalculate that assumption?
I appreciate both questions. On the first one, when I met with President-elect in the week after the election, we spoke specifically about the New York City law. This same list categories. I did not hand him the list, but I went over with him, and at that moment, actually, Jeff Sessions had come into the room literally at that point in the conversation. So we had a conversation, all three of us. And I said, here is an example of a middle ground that works. This city, which is very interested in public safety and in keeping law and order intact, this city, by law, by a vote of our city council and a bill signed by me, determined 170 categories of crime, where if someone commits these crimes, they are undoubtedly going to be deported, and we're going to work with the federal authorities on that. I then emphasized that what we wanted to guard against was individuals who had done exceedingly low-level crimes. And I'll give you examples. Someone has small amount of marijuana. Someone who committed a traffic offense that did not cause any harm to anyone else. You'll look at this list. I want to ask all of you, please, this is such an important issue. Literally, for hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers right now, they're very deeply concerned. When you look at this list, you will not doubt for a moment this covers everything conceivable in terms of serious and violent crime. So I explained that to the President-elect. I explained that to the Attorney General. And I said, this is a model, and I know other cities have similar approaches that could address the fair concerns people have about those who commit serious crime, but respect millions of others who are part of the fabric of our communities. There was two parts, I'm sorry.
The second question was, you said that you didn't think Donald Trump would hurt the city because he is a New Yorker. Do you think with this action today that you need to recalculate?
I think your statement's a little too generous in terms of what I said previously, meaning I was not that blank check for the president. I said I hoped that the president, as a New Yorker, would remember where he came from and would understand what his words had meant and his proposals had meant already. I told him about the fear they had created, and I told them that, you know, I didn't doubt he loved the city, but he had to understand what 8.5 million people were experiencing as a result of his words and proposals. Today, we see something that's very troubling and is not encouraging at all. But again, I'm not going to minimize the danger for a moment, but I am going to tell you in terms of how we stand and fight. When we look at this executive order, we think there's lots of ways to stand and fight.
Two more questions.
Anyway, let me just ask, anyone didn't get one who has one before we go back to Laura? Yeah.
Is it at all possible, or is it in the realm of the imagination of lawmakers here, you, that the many millions of dollars in tax abatements that he's given on his buildings might be reevaluated?
Well, Henry, that is a rather fascinating proposal. If we do it, we'll call it Henry's Law. I hadn't thought of that one. I will certainly have the authorities look into that. Thank you.
I wanted to ask you specifically about this line from the executive order that says the director of OMB is directed to obtain and provide relevant and responsive information on all federal grant money that currently is received by any sanctuary jurisdiction. Are you saying that you understand that to mean just DOJ and DHS, or that's...
No, we talked about this. I'll start and you jump in or come on over and help me. I'll start. I'll speak English. He'll speak lawyer. We believe, again, there are a series of vague items, somewhat contradictory items, items that could be implemented one way or another. There's a lot going on. We think the Supreme Court decision, written by Justice Roberts, suggests narrowness, very clear, or demands narrowness, that it only can relate to the specific agencies that are the subject. So that would be Homeland Security and Justice. That's how we read this. That's if they wanted, if they wanted to threaten funding, it would be those two agencies, which specifically means, from a New York City point of view, overwhelmingly NYPD and, to a lesser extent, correction. On that last line, that's a nice line to include, but we don't believe that conforms with the law.
I agree. I believe that that last line falls into the category of gesture. It raises alarms, but again, in the earlier parts of the executive law, it talks about everything having to be consistent with law. And I think they knew as they drafted this that broad catch-all in the end that asked OMB to look at all funding streams without regard to whether or not they were related to an immigration enforcement is clearly not in play.
What makes you think, though, given the president's demonstrated ability or willingness to do things outside of what we might see as normal in the scope of political activity, that he doesn't intend to, I mean, he's going to nominate a new Supreme Court justice and could potentially have a majority in the Supreme Court that could relitigate that.
You used two different words. You used ability and willingness, and they're very different. He might be willing to do a lot of things. He's not able to do very much.
Can I add, and Zach, you're the Supreme Court expert. You will catch me if I make a mistake here. 2012, Justice Scalia was alive. The court makeup was the same as it will be when the president names another member.
That's correct.
So it was a Republican-dominated court and a decision written by Chief Justice Roberts. So when you say unusual things have been happening in America, you're right about that. But that's a real recent decision, and it's a very clear decision, and we think that's going to be dispositive. Thanks, everyone.
Were you joking about looking into the tax
I heard it for the first time, Willie. Take it as a joke for now.